Hello, everybody, and welcome to Adamize. I'm here with Elise Foley of the Huffington Post, who's a fantastic immigration reporter who has a lot to say about all the crazy happenings of the past couple weeks. How are you doing, Elise?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm good. So I'm interested to hear how long you think the sort of weird niceness between immigration reform opponents and immigration reform supporters is going to last?
Well, I think that it'll last a little bit until we have an actual bill. So it's easier to agree to something if it's really broad, like the Senate framework is. Everybody agrees, yes, we shouldn't make it easy. There shouldn't be amnesty for a path to citizenship. We should have more border security, easier legal immigration. All of those are easy to say. I mean, if you'd asked me a month ago, longer ago, what would immigration reform include? That's what I would have said. The problem comes down to all the details, and I think that, the sooner that they get all that stuff done, the sooner that we'll start all fighting about it, and Republicans and Democrats will really be at odds.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's one of the things that, I've been talking to some immigration, the sort of hardline immigration reform opponents from like the John Tanton groups and stuff like that. And they're all just saying, wait till we get a bill and then we're going to start. They're going to be, the way that they put it is like they're going to be all these like crazy little things in there that, they can just pull out and be like, hey, Mr. Republican who's facing a primary in a couple months, are you really going to vote for this?
Yeah, exactly. And Numbers USA, which is one of those groups, is already, asking its members to call up congressional offices and say, look, we don't support this Obama framework that he's put out. We don't want it. And that's a little different. His ideas are a little bit more liberal than the Senate framework, but they're largely similar. So I think that, we'll be able to expect Numbers USA, all these other groups to kind of come out and try to force congressional offices to be intimidated into not voting for it. And I expect that to really start in earnest once they have an actual bill, probably in the next 2 months.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody forgets, but, immigration reform was a bit of a bipartisan love fest last time around, too, right? I mean, McCain-Kennedy is there's sort of, I think McCain was a lot more hated on the right in 2006, 2007 than Rubio is today. I think that's a significant difference. But these were two very respected elder statesmen of the Senate, who and people that I think there was like a lot of sort of elite consensus that this might actually get done. Yeah. Similar to the way there is now, and I think we've all, sort of forgotten what a bloody fight it was.
Yeah, exactly. And they had George Bush on, pushing for it. That's a Republican president. I mean, that's pretty significant. Now, Obama has this reputation with Republicans as being sort of untrustworthy, pushed healthcare reform through, all of that. And, their idea is that he doesn't really care what they think. So that's sort of damaging to this kind of fight. I think, having Republican president supporting it was probably an easier sell. I think the people are right, though, that the politics of it have changed. And I think that that is the biggest difference between now and 2007. If now you can look at it and say, okay, we have all these, hardliners mad at us, but we also will gain all these other people who are supportive of it, then it's kind of easier for people to ignore Numbers USA members and ignore all these other groups. Not to say it'll happen, but it's possible.
Right. But I think you're getting at something really important, right? So is this lack of trust, and I don't think it's entirely deserved, right? So, what people say to me, what like sort of the anti-immigration folks say is like Obama isn't really enforcing the law, and you can see that on like Republican websites. And this is because Obama has done things like say, oh, we're only going after criminals, and, we're going to exempt the DREAM Act eligible immigrants from deportation. But like those, like the criminals thing isn't like entirely true.
Yeah, I mean,
it's certainly not. It's certainly they've certainly deported what they refer to as more criminals than non-criminals. But in fact, like a lot of the people getting deported their criminal offenses are very minor. It's stuff like, it's like,
traffic violations.
Right.
I mean, and you don't even
like
have to be convicted of something to count as,
right.
A criminal. So it's a sort of inflated statistic.
But apart from that, like, the Obama administration has deported a shitload of people.
Yep.
1.5 million people, which is almost as many as Bush did in 2 years. In 8 years, Obama's done in 4. But like Republicans have been hearing this sort of amnesty thing, so they just don't trust him.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. He's broken the record multiple years in a row and has said, look, we have the funding to deport 400,000 people a year. It seems to be sort of a quota, although they won't necessarily say that. And he hit more than 400,000 this year. I guess I shouldn't say he didn't personally do it, but, his administration. Right. And so... yeah, the amnesty claim is just sort of frustrating. It's like, what would they have to do to prove that they care about immigration enforcement, like, beyond separating even more families, sending even more people back to their home countries? Like, the border stuff, too. I mean, there have been huge improvements in border security, and, people would admit that. Like, John McCain and Jeff Flake from Arizona were... saying that yesterday, and it's just the case that border security is up. We're spending more on border security than, we have been. And so all of this stuff is like, all right, what do you want to see before you believe that, immigration enforcement and border stuff is already happening? Like, what's the metric? And that's a little frustrating to see them sort of move the goalpost on it to a point where it's like they're never happy with how much is actually getting done. Right.
I mean, one of the things, I think the actual metric for for whether or not, for this is going to turn out, whether or not the bill adequately sort of takes security into account, is probably going to be what people like Rubio and Flake say.
Yeah, and they have, I think they're meeting with DHS. They want to make sure that, they talk to them about what DHS considers operational security, and there is a definition for that. I mean, there are parts of Arizona and other places that have operational security and define it that way already. So there's precedent for it. The framework, though, is kind of weird. They say that there should be this border governor group, and it's like, okay, how much say are we going to give, Jan Brewer on this to say, okay, we're good, let's move forward with things? Because there's some definition, but there's not a clear one. So, yeah, I mean, I think people like Rubio and Flake are going to be important in assuring Republicans that, no, look, we're really going to get a secure border with this. We'll see what that means.
That this is like a clear sort of future problem that you can already see coming is the Southwest Border Commission, and the extent of its authority is already sort of a point of disagreement within the Gang of Eight who came in the Senate, who came together to put together a proposal. The Democrats are saying it has no binding authority. Rubio is saying, well, if it doesn't have binding authority, I'm not going to be involved. It's very, and to a certain extent, it's important for Republicans and Democrats. It's like actually, Rubio sent out a press release sort of slamming Obama's immigration speech yesterday, and I actually think a certain amount of there has to be a certain amount of friction between Republicans and Democrats, even among those who support it. Yeah. Otherwise, Republicans won't trust it.
I mean, I think it's good to be like, look, we stood up to the president and we won on it. Even if the wins are kind of small, it's good just politics-wise to be like, no, it could have been further left. We're the ones who brought it back. Flake actually said that yesterday. He said that this was before Obama's speech, and people were asking, okay, Obama probably won't have those triggers. Will that mess up negotiations? And he actually said, it could be better if Obama doesn't agree with it, because then we can show the distinction between the two. And I think that that's sort of a political thing to be able to say, no, this shows that we're even more serious than Obama on border security, and, that's why you should vote for it.
Yeah, there was this sort of surreal moment the past couple of days where you've seen, really right-wing pundits being like, no, in effect, if I were to use their language, it would be like, no, Rubio's amnesty is so much better than Obama's amnesty.
Yeah, I mean, it's annoying. They just changed the definition of pathway for whoever says it. It's like, oh, yeah, and now a pathway is okay. I mean, that's fine.
Right.
However you get to that point, I guess.
But it's fantastic for reform.
Yeah.
It's fantastic for reform if, like, the right flank of the argument is, like, no, we should have a tougher amnesty instead of we shouldn't have, an amnesty at all. And I think amnesty is a little misleading because, I mean, these people do have to pay
it's
penalties
totally misleading.
And spend a long time meeting very strict behavioral standards in both plans. Meeting very strict behavioral standards before they get a path to citizenship. So amnesty, I think, is actually kind of a misleading word for it, but it's certainly what the right considers amnesty.
Yeah, I mean, it's so silly with the word amnesty. Nobody's saying, like, all right, we passed the bill, you can stay, like, nothing has to happen. I mean, the amount of stuff you'd have to go through, it'll take years for people to become citizens. So I think that's another reason why all this argument about it's just going to create a bunch of Democratic voters is sort of frustrating, but
not for a really long time.
Yeah, exactly. Like, all right,
even
maybe
if it were true, not for a really long time.
Yeah, and exactly, and there are other political things that would change whatever. So, yeah, I mean, amnesty is a total word that people use just to kill things. It's a misnomer. I think that them accepting it is a good thing, but I think that Republicans are doing a good job of being like, no, this is an amnesty, and they're right on that. It's not.
So I'm interested what you think are going to be the like public option like deal breakers for people, both on either side. But I think I can already see one emerging on the left with the sort of the benefits for same-sex couples, which Republicans are really sort of weirdly hostile to. Not just opposed to, but like hostile to, as you reported yesterday. But I'm interested to hear from you what you think some of these are going to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a big one. I think that they think, like, we're trying to do this thing that's hard already. Why are you throwing something else in? Which is, I mean, a legitimate point. It's like you kind of don't want to complicate it more than you should. At the same time, you have all these people who can't petition for green cards, even if they're legally married. So that's, I mean, seems to be just blatantly unfair, but it is adding a social issue. I think that beyond that, I think there will be fights over how to do the border enforcement. A lot of people think, look, we spend a ton of money on it already. We spend more on immigration stuff than we do on, FBI, DEA, ATF, all these groups combined. And so I think a lot of people will say, like, look, if you're such deficit hawks, then, like, let's not add a bunch to it. I think other people will probably be concerned about the way immigration enforcement sort of goes down. There's this issue, like we were talking about before, with who gets defined as a criminal. So where are they going to draw that line? I mean, if you're saying you have to go through a background check, like, okay, what if you go through a background check and it turns out that you had some weird, like, trespassing charge when you were in high school, like sneaking onto some field or whatever? There are so many things that you could have been
What happens if you're like,
for.
Got into some youthful mischief or something?
Yeah, exactly. And, like, if you or I had something like that, no one would care. Like, employers and stuff wouldn't care. It's just not a big deal, not to condone law breaking, I guess. But yeah, I mean, it's like, where are you going to draw that line? And if you draw that line too low, then that means that all these people would be unable to apply for citizenship, and the pathway doesn't really count. So I think that that's a major question, and I think Democrats are going to be particularly concerned with how you define that, because, you don't want to try and fix it and then rule out a bunch of people that, they don't want ruled out.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I was struck particularly, because you wrote up Lindsey Graham's remarks yesterday, where he said, when someone asked him about same-sex couples, he said, well, why don't we just add legalized abortion in the bill? Which I found sort of shocking, because it's not like the question isn't germane, right? I mean, if we're talking about, because part of both the Senate proposal and Obama's proposal deals with, like, people's families. So, we're literally talking about what's recognized as a family, and there's no question that same-sex couples, families headed by same-sex couples are families. The question is whether or not federal law will treat them as such and whether the immigration bill treats them as such. That's germane to this in a way that, say, abortion isn't.
Right.
So I was actually sort of shocked to see Graham be quite so dismissive, but I think it's, this is something that I think liberals particularly are going to fight really, really hard for.
Well, and I mean, everybody says in immigration reform, right, that it's not just undocumented immigrants that are have a problem, but it's also legal immigration. So the family, the family part is really important. And, some people are overstaying their visas because, say, they're married to somebody, they have children. I think there's a study from UCLA that I think binational same-sex couples have like 25,000 children, or 25,000, children have binational same-sex parents. And so it's a big deal to a lot of people. That's less than 11 million, but that's families that, if your priority is keeping families together as part of immigration reform, your priority is to not give people these incentives to stay in the country when they're not supposed to, then, why not recognize it? John McCain, though, actually said sort of the same thing as Graham today, also used the abortion line, and he was like, you know what, like, if you want to derail it, this is the best way to do it. So I think that Republicans are sort of drawing a line on that. I don't know, no matter how hard Democrats fight for it, I don't know if they'd be willing to kill the whole thing over keeping same-sex couples in it. I think, like, sad as that is to say, I kind of think people might cave on it. I think that there's this idea that, if DOMA goes away anyway, then this won't be a problem. But in the meantime, there are all these people who have a problem,
Even if people cave on it, my expectation is that it will be a huge deal.
Oh, I totally agree.
Obama's going to get a lot of shit if they cave on this, even though I think it might be necessary to get a bill passed. If we get to that point, even if they do, it's certainly going to be like it could be like the public option in terms of a reflection of Obama's insufficient commitment.
Yeah, and I mean it's such a huge civil rights issue. So if you cave on it, it's placing a priority on one thing over another. I mean, I see the argument about DOMA, right? I mean, there's arguments that this problem will go away anyway, but at the same time, it's like saying that, look, we don't care. Sorry. And the Obama administration, to its credit, it has all these guidelines on where they can kind of not ignore. That's bad. I shouldn't parrot that line. Where they can give discretion to not deport people, say they're low priority, and they define same-sex couples as families in that. So,
that's why Republicans might make it a target.
Exactly. It's like, okay, you're already giving amnesty to these people. So
we already see what you're doing, and we might want to stop you from doing it.
Yeah. To me, it seems like such a sort of minor point that it sort of seems odd for them to make such a big deal about it. It's not minor. I mean, it's important, but in the grand scheme, like, letting families stay together, like, all right, if you want to fight against that, like, you can do it. I mean, I think it's
right. I think it's less. I think right now, because we're in this sort of lovey-dovey phase, the politics of it are better for Republicans because it makes it seem like Democrats are making unreasonable demands.
Yeah.
But look, I mean, we've got we've got gay marriage cases, same-sex marriage cases coming before the Supreme Court. Most of the country, I would say, probably recognizes that families headed by same-sex couples are real families. Most of the country, I think, maybe not most Republicans, but most of the country at this point. And I think, I think once we start getting into the specifics, the politics of it might not be as cut and dry as they seem now, where like everybody's working very hard to seem nice and willing to work with each other. Regardless of whether or not that's what they're really thinking.
Yeah, and I mean, I think just in terms of the country's support, it's such a big, it's not the same as allowing people to get married. It's not even that far. It's like, not do you support same-sex marriage, it's like, do you support forcing couples, either American citizens to have to leave the country, basically get forced out if they want to stay with their spouse, or, forcing them to be apart or deporting one of them. It's like, it's a smaller ask. Do you support separating families just because of this, or do you support same-sex marriage? It's, it's smaller. And so I think that the public, I would think, would be able to get behind it. And so maybe you can get some pressure on it. I think that you're right. It'll be a big fight.
So we've had a bunch of really big swings in conventional wisdom regarding how much benefit Republicans get from immigration reform. And so at first, the consensus right after the election was Republicans have to do this to be competitive with the Latino vote. And then, there were a couple of polls that came out that showed Latinos are actually pretty liberal, despite the fact that they go to church. And I don't know why anybody would be surprised by this. African Americans are the most loyal Democratic voting bloc in the country, and they also have extremely high church attendance.
Yeah.
And so we heard a lot of the sort of Republican natural conservative rhetoric, which I think is natural Republican rhetoric, which I think is like kind of reductive and very flattering to Republicans, but not necessarily a good way to do outreach. But I actually think, so now the conventional wisdom is this actually won't help Republicans, and I don't think that's true. And the reason why I think it will actually help Republicans is that it will take the issue off the table so that Republicans are not constantly saying horrible things about immigrants that are perceived as hostility towards Latinos and other people of color.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, all the polling shows that the most important issue for Latino voters is, the economy, jobs, education, healthcare a lot of times rank above immigration. But the thing is that people get pissed if you're saying all this stuff that's perceived as hating people who are Latino. And so the percentage of people, who know somebody who's undocumented is so much higher with Hispanics than it is with the population at large. And so it's like this issue that, like you said, is something that is completely off-putting. I think you're exactly right. I mean, Republicans would be totally saved by not having this issue where they put their foot in their mouth and say things like self-deport and, build the dang fence or whatever. And I
if
think,
nothing else, they can make their pitch, right?
Right.
They can now make their whole pitch without having to also defend the party's restrictive position on immigration, which sounds like we don't want too many Latinos here.
Yeah, people will actually listen to them rather than at the beginning being like, you know what, like, I don't even like you, you hate us, so I'm not interested in what you have to say. So, yeah, and I think it's true that Republicans, a lot of them say, and Reagan, I believe, kind of came up with this, that Hispanics are Republicans, they just don't know it yet, which I think is like, it's offensive, really. I mean, but I think that could be the case with some people, and those are the people who you might win over. The further down the line people get generationally, once you get to be like fourth, fifth generation, the patterns aren't as far toward leaning Democratic. I mean, it's still majority. Right. So there's down the line, I think, more of a chance to, grow the Republican support from Hispanics if they don't just continue making everybody angry and offended.
Right. I mean, like, I think there's, like, to the extent that Latinos follow the same pattern as, like, white ethnic groups, towards in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, like, to the extent that they sort of assimilate and become, obviously white is a social construct, but white in the sense that they're become part of a larger mass where there are sort of cultural differences, Irish, Italian, but are not considered sort of a separate subgroup. I mean, I think that it bodes well for the GOP, but obviously we're generations away from that, at least, or at least one or two, from that happening in like really substantial numbers. And I think that does get put off when you sort of remind even a white, someone who might identify as white but has like a Hispanic last name, and like sort of, that person is made more conscious of being Latino by the sense that Republicans don't like them for being Latino.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that it's such a mobilizing issue. I mean, in Arizona, Flake won in the end his Senate seat, but you had a ton of, immigrant rights groups, even like young undocumented immigrants, going out and knocking on doors, trying to get Latinos to get out and vote. And one of the ways they did that was, talking about immigration. Like, these dreamers were able to say, look at me, I'm getting totally hurt by Republican policies. And that race ended up being closer than a lot of people expected. And I think that they recognize that, it's not helpful to them to, even in the meantime, if Latinos aren't won over by them, it's not helpful, since even if that's not the case, then that means it's not helpful to get them out to vote. That's really cynical. But it's such a mobilizing issue, and if it wasn't a mobilizing issue, then you might have fewer people go out to try and vote out the Republicans. So it could work in their advantage in that sense. McCain actually said today that he thinks Arizona would go to be a Democratic state if immigration reform goes down because of Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think if Republicans help pass immigration reform, I don't think it's going to make Latinos love them, right. But I think that it will certainly help them in the long run. I mean, they're not going to get credit for it because there's a Democratic president. They're not going to get like 100% credit for it in the same way. But I do think in a sort of long run, by taking the issue off the table, I do think it helps. Yeah,
and I mean, even if people don't love you, it's better that they feel closer to neutral than if they hate you and they think that you hate them. So, yeah, I mean, it's better than nothing, even if it doesn't mean getting a majority of Hispanic votes.
Well, look, Elise, I just want to thank you so much for coming on Adamize. I really enjoyed the discussion. I hope to have you on again in the future.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Bye.